Friends, I welcome you all to our today's session. This session is again on the concept of supply. Supply is a very big concept, and see, there are various areas where there are possibilities of dispute in that area. So, few more concepts we'll be discussing today. And today, this is the 8th class on the concept of supply. So, let me share the screen with you. Give me a moment. Many things we have understood in the previous session also. We had some cases, some case studies, small caselets we are doing. By this time, we have already understood the concept of supply. That once again, I would like to remind you that this is what section 7 deals with the meaning and the scope of supply. And if you recall the section 7 again, you see it says supply includes sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in the course or furtherance of business. So these terms are important. Consideration, business, course or furtherance of, and all these things, sale, etc. Importation of services for a consideration, whether or not it is in the course of furtherance of business, are also supply. Then there are certain activities which are specified in Schedule 1, which are made or agreed to be made without consideration. They are also supply. So what are the items included in Schedule 1? We have already seen those things. Right. So we have analyzed the provision in detail. And meaning of consideration, these are some examples, some cases we have already done in your previous class. The concept of related person and distinct person was also important, which we have discussed. And supply by employer to employee or from employee to employer, perquisites, etc. we have discussed. In fact, the previous class, finally we concluded with this concept, that supply between agent and principal, right? So in which situation that we treated as supply, those things we have considered, those cases we have taken into account. Principal agent relationship. Today we are supposed to start with this concept, delegator agent concept, or DCA, popularly called as DCA. But before that, when we are discussing about the concept, one thing we have understood. Let me find out that slide for you. Yeah, when we are discussing this slide, we have understood when supply is made, let us say the agent has received goods from the principal and agent is supplying it to the buyer or the recipient. Whether it is a supply by the agent or it is a supply by the principal depends on, among other things, depends on this concept that who is raising the invoice. Right? Have you remembered this? Who is raising the invoice? That is important. So what I will do, let us say, let us take an example. Let us say there is a principal and there is an agent and there is a buyer or in GST terminology we'll call it as the recipient. Okay, so principal is supplying to the agent and agent is supplying to the, let's say a principal is delivering the goods to the agent and agent is delivering the goods to the buyer. In that case, we have understood one more concept. We have to see the invoice. Who is raising the invoice? Okay, if principal is raising the invoice to the buyer, then principal is the supplier. If agent is raising an invoice to the buyer, then here is one supply Principal to agent one supply, and agent to buyer one more supply. Did you understand this concept? Yes, sir. So you have to see who is raising the invoice. Agent is directly raising the invoice. That means property in goods are with agent, and he is transferring that property. So when agent is transferring to the buyer, there is a supply, and when principal hard transfer it to the agent, there is 1%. But invoices are directly raised by the principal to the buyer. Okay, even if the agent in between has facilitated the transaction, then you can say there is a supply of goods between the principal to buyer directly. Hope you have understood this concept. Okay, understanding this concept is important to appreciate the next concept, and the concept of deliberation. So let me take you to that slide. Okay, so some of you might be knowing what is the meaning of deliberation agent or DC. It is basically, or the DCA is basically a selling agent who is engaged by the principal to assist in supply of goods and services by contacting the potential buyers on behalf of the principal. So in fact, this DCA will be helping the principal in finding out the potential buyers. That is his job. Okay. And what is the difference between the DCA and the normal agent is that DCA also guarantees the payment to the supplier. DCA gives a guarantee that the buyers shall be making payment. That guarantee is given. And to ensure that, the DCA might be offering various additional facilities to the buyer. DCA may give a loan to the buyer so that buyer will be able to pay the money to the supplier. So like this, certain services are provided by the DC. So this is the typical character of a DC, where in addition to facilitating or in addition to searching the potential buyer, he also helps the principal in recovering the money. He almost gives a guarantee that money will be recovered. Hope you have understood what is DC. Okay. Now, how it happens? So in this scenario, where there is a DCA arrangement, if the buyer fails to make payment, let us say due date has arrived and buyer has failed to make payment, then DCA makes the payment to the principal on behalf of the buyer. So the principal is assured of his money. And for this kind of additional services, DCA is given a commission. Okay. So therefore, the commission of a DCA or the deliberation agent is normally higher than the commission which is paid to a normal agent. Normal agent's responsibility is to facilitate the sales transaction, but DCA in addition to that makes guarantee. Okay, and in order to guarantee timely payment to the supplier, DCA can resort to various methods. What DCA can do? These methods includes extending certain transactions based on the loans to the buyers. Okay, suppose you see a situation. Let me tell you. Okay, let us say principal is there, agent is also there, and here the agent is DC. Okay, and there is a buyer. On due date, this buyer is supposed to pay to the principal, is it? But in case buyer fails, DCA may give a loan to the buyer. That possibility is also arises. This is one of the methods which DCA may resort. what it can do, DCA may give some loan to the buyer so that buyer will be able to make payment to, to the principal. Okay, now here the biggest question comes that if DCA is giving a loan, DCA may be charging some interest. Yes or no? Interest may be charged. Can you reply?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, one thing is that principal is giving commission to this. There will be some commission. Principal must be paying some commission to this. DCA is giving loan, and buyer is also paying some interest. Buyer is also paying some interest. Okay. Now here the big question is that whether this interest component which buyer is paying the money to the principal, whether this will be included with the value of goods and services. What is coming to your mind? Because this is also some kind of consideration which is in relation to supplier. What do you feel? Whether it should be included or not? We have not yet learned the provisions. I'll be telling you the provisions. But what is coming to your mind? Interest is also paid. Whether it will form a part of consideration or not. What do you think? Can you answer me? Okay, let us learn the provisions first. Okay. Let me first explain you the concept of supply. Give me a moment for that. Concept of supply relating to DC. So as we are talking right now that in order to guarantee the timely payment to the supplier, DCA can resort to various methods, including extending short-term transaction based on loans to the buyer, if we give a loan to the buyer, or paying the supplier himself and recovering the amount from the buyer with some interest at a later. Okay, both the things DCA may do with some interest. It may give a loan to the buyer, or it may pay directly to the supplier. That you see, since he has given guarantee, he is paying that. And later on, he is going to recover this same money from the buyer or the recipient with some interest. But finally, the loan has to be repaid by the buyer because the DCA is paying on behalf of the buyer. Loan is to be repaid by the buyer along with the interest to the DCA. And the rate of interest is mutually agreed between the DCA and buyer. This is the situation. Now the question which asked was whether this interest will form a part of consideration in relation to supply or not. That was the question. Now let us discuss that thing one by one. Yeah, this is a typical situation which is addressed in this particular circular. That's circular number 73 by 47 by 2018 GST, dated 5 November 2018. Certain issues, specific issues are clarified. So we need to discuss this thing because they're very, you can say, they addresses very specific situations, very important situations. Okay, first issue we are going to see that whether DCA falls under the ambit of agent under para 3 of schedule 1 of the CGST. In the previous session, when we are discussing about the concept of agent, we have already understood that who is an agent. Agent principal definitions we have understood, and in in which context they are important, that also we have understood. And we have also understood one more thing, that who is raising an invoice, that plays an important role in the context of GST. Who is raising the invoice? So this circular 57 by 31 by 2018 discusses about this thing, whether DCA will fall under the ambit of an agent or not. It is discussed here. Now here the final conclusion is that in case where invoice for supply of goods is issued by supplier to the customer, either by himself or through DCA, who is issuing the invoice? It is issued by the supplier, means the principal. Either principal is issuing directly or principal is issuing through DCA. If that is the situation, then DCA does not fall under the ambit of agent. Okay. That means supply is made directly by the principal to the recipient. Why it is so? Because it is the principal who is raising the invoice. So therefore, from beginning, we are discussing that who is raising invoice, that plays a key role. Second point, if you see, in case when the invoice of supply of goods is issued by DCA in its own name. Now, here in this situation, what happened? DCA is issued the invoice. In that situation, DCA will fall under the ambit of an agent. DCA is an agent. And in that case, there will be two suppliers. DCA is supplying to the buyer, and the principal is also supplying to the DCA. Okay. Is it clear to you? Yes or no? Is it clear to all of you? Yes, friends. Yeah, this is what I was showing you, this slide, that what is important is who is raising the invoice. On that basis, it will be decided whether actually this DCA falls under the ambit of agent or not. Okay, it depends upon who is raising the invoice. Now, one more concept, again addressed in that circular. You have to see that thing. Next issue is that whether temporary short-term transaction based on loan extended by DCA to the recipient. That means the DCA has given a loan to the recipient for which interest is charged by the DCA. Now, question is that whether it is to be included in the value of goods supplied by the supplier, where DCA is not an agent. Now, we are talking about the situation that DCA is not an agent. When DCA is not an agent, when invoices are raised directly by the supplier is directly by the principal. Either it may be raised directly or maybe indirectly through DCA also, but invoices are raised by the principal in its own name. If that is the case, the DCA is not an agent. But in that case, let us say DCA has extended some loan to the recipient and charging some interest, whether that interest will be included or not. So if you break up this scenario, what about the activities, what has happened? We can say, first of all, what has happened? The supply of goods by the supplier or principal to the recipient. That is no doubt about it. The principal has supplied goods to the recipient. Then supply of agency services from DCA to the supplier to the recipient. Now, what DCA has done, DCA has extended an agency services. He has not supplied any goods because goods are directly supplied by the principal to agent. But DCA has extended the agency services to who? To the supplier and also to the recipient. And supply of extension of loan services by DCA to the recipient. One more thing DCA has done. He has extended a loan service to the recipient. He has extended a loan also. Loan also DCA has given. In this situation, it is clarified in the circular that where DCA is not an agent, the temporary short-term transaction based on the loan being provided by the DCA to supplier shall be considered as a supply of services by the DCA. And that is an independent supply of service. And that supply has done on a principal to principal basis, not at the agent of the original principal. Therefore, whatever interest is charged by the DCA would not form a part of value of supply. Okay, value of supply means value of supply of goods. I think you have understood the transaction. If you have not understood, let me explain you the help of this whiteboard. Yes, friends. You have already understood the transaction. Here is a principal. Principal is paying commission to the DCA. That we know. And DCA has given a loan to the buyer. And invoices are raised by who? In this situation, I'm talking about invoices are raised by the principal. Principal is raising invoices either directly to the buyer, buyer is the receiver, or through DCA is raising to the buyer. But invoice is in the name of the principal. If that is the case, then this DCA will not be treated as an agent. It's not an agent. Okay. Supply is made directly by the principal. It will be treated like this. And we can break the transaction into various parts. First part is that one thing is no doubt principal has supplied goods to buyer. Second thing is that DCA has made two supplies, but not supply of goods. DCA has made the supply of services to the principal. DCA is helping the principal in finding out the buyer. So he is making a supply. And DCA is also making one more supply, that arranging a seller for the buyer. So DCA is providing, this is supply of services, this is also supply of services, not supply of goods. Supply of goods is only between the principal and the buyer. Okay. And in addition to that, DCA is making one more services, that is providing a loan. And these transactions which DCA is doing, DCA is not doing as an agent. DCA is doing as a principal to principal transaction. What DCA is doing for the buyer, that is a principal. He is doing it in his own capacity. What DCA is doing to this principal, he is doing in his own capacity. So these transactions are on a principal to principal basis. Understood? And this is an independent supply. This loan is an independent supply. Therefore, whatever interest is charged, that shouldn't be taken as a consideration. That will not be included in the value of goods. This is supply of goods. But these are supply of services. Okay, this thing has been clarified in the circular. Now, this is the situation where DCA is not treated as an agent. Why DCA is not treated as an agent? Simply because DCA has not raised invoice in his own name. Now we'll come to the next situation, where DCA is treated as an agent. What will happen in that situation? Let us see that. Okay, now you see this has been clarified in the circular that this is an independent supply. Interest charge will not form a part of value of supply. Now, second situation we'll see. Okay, the situation is like this. DCA is an agent under para 3, schedule 1 of CGST. DCA is agent. In which situation DCA is agent? DCA is agent when DCA is raising invoice in its own name. It is receiving goods from the principal and selling it to the buyer, but he himself is raising invoices. In that case, there are two supplies, principal to DCA and DCA to buyer. And DCA makes payment to principal on behalf of the buyer and charges interest to the buyer for delayed payment along with the value of goods supplied. Now, question is that whether goods supply, whether the interest form a part of value of goods. Now, let us understand this. Here, DCA is not an agent because DCA is raising invoices independently. So, as you know, in this there are two suppliers. So, you'll break the activities like this: supply of goods by the principal to the DCA. That is one activity. Second activity is that further supply of goods by DCA to recipient. Third activity is that supply of agency services by DCA to the supplier as well as recipient. Agency services supplied to both. Then extension of credit facilities by DCA to the recipient. In this case, it is clarified where DCA is an agent, okay, and he has extended short-term credit facilities. In this situation, the buyer no longer retains its character of independent supplier, and it is subsumed in the supply of goods by the DCA to the recipient. That means what? The temporary short-term transaction based on credit being provided by the DCA to the buyer no longer retains the character of an independent supplier. It is not an independent supplier. It is subsumed in the supply of goods. So this indicates that when this interest is charged by the DC to the buyer, that interest shall be included in the value of supply of goods. Okay. So we can conclude the activity of extension of credit by DCA to the recipient would not be considered as a separate supply, as it is in the context of supply of goods made by DCA to the recipient. Let me explain you this thing with the help of this whiteboard. Now, friends, you see, situation is slightly different here. Now, what has happened? DCA is an agent. When DCA is an agent, if you see, now we can break the supplies like this. Principal is supplying to DCA and DCA is supplying to buyer, and both are goods. This is also goods. This is also goods. Both are goods. Okay, goods are supplied. This is one. And DCA is again supplying agency services to the principal, agency services to the buyer. Same logic. This is a service, this is a service. Now, what has happened? DCA is directly paying to the principal. On due date, if the buyer has failed to pay, DCA is paying to the principal. And how DCA is recovering? DCA is recovering money from the buyer. The interest is recovering. In that case, this interest which is recovering, this will not be treated as an independent transaction. It is not an independent supply. This interest is in the context of goods supplied by the DCA to the buyer, and he is recovering interest for that. In that case, the interest amount should be included in the value of supply. Okay. Interest paid by buyer to the DCA should be included in the value of goods. Hope you have understood this. Okay. That interest amount shall not be considered, or the loan transaction shall not be considered as independent transaction. Okay. So it is in the context of supply of goods made by DCA to the buyer, So therefore, it has to be subsumed in the supply of goods. Okay, is it clear to you? Concept of deliberation agent. If it is clear, yeah, is it clear?
Can you just repeat that, like how, like telecommuter agent will be giving back to like the principal part that one?
Sorry, please repeat your question.
Like if the creator agent will be giving like he is charging some interest from the like buyer in case like it will be delayed. The reverse thing you told, that one I couldn't get it. Like from how the principal something you told.
The reverse thing means I'm not getting the exact situation. I told you, let me summarize what I wrote. So I told you, now you've understood what is deliberation agent or DC. Deliberation agents, what they do, they give an additional service. They give a guarantee that money will be recovered from the buyer. That guarantee they give to their principal. Okay. So this principal is assured of his recovery. But how they do it, they may directly pay to the principal on the due date. The creditor agent may directly pay the money to the principal, so principal gets his money. Later on, he may recover that money from the buyer. Okay. Right. Are you getting me?
Yeah, I understood. First, you will be collecting on that one. But that part I could confuse.
So that is one. Or what it can do, it can give a loan to the buyer, and buyer will be paying money to the principal. These are the two common ways in which the creditor agent helps both buyer and seller. Now, in this situation, now our question comes that the creditor agent might be collecting some interest from the buyer. Now, whether that interest shall be included in the value of goods or not. Right? Whether it is to be included in the value of goods or not. Now, how we'll do that? First, we'll have to see that whether this creditor agent shall be regarded as an agent or not. Okay. So, as I was explaining you, we have to see who is raising the invoice. If invoice is raised directly by the principal to the buyer, or invoice is raised through DCA to the buyer, but it is raised by the principal. Principal is raising the invoice. If principal is raising the invoice, then technically DCA is not an agent. It is a supply made directly principal to the buyer. It's a different story that DCA is extending additional services to the principal as well as the buyer. DCA is finding a buyer for the principal and finding a supplier for the buyer. They're independent services. And if DCA has extended some loan to the buyer, that is also an independent supplier. And all these transactions DCA is doing as a principal to principal basis. DCA is not behaving as an agent here. Although you may call it as the agent and pay agency commission, but he's doing that thing as an independent capacity. They are independent suppliers. Therefore, if some interest is recovered by the DCA, that will not be added with the value of goods. Okay, because value of this supply of goods is a different transaction, and these type of services are different. But on the other hand, if we consider DCA as an agent, when we are going to consider DCA as an agent, when invoices are raised by DCA, in that case, what exactly happens? Here is one supply. Goods are supplied by the principal to DCA, and DCA is making a further supply to the buyer. Okay. In addition to that, DCA is also supplying services to the principal, supplying services to the buyer. Okay. For buyer, he is finding out the supply. For principal, he is finding out the buyer. There's an additional service. And DCA is also extending a loan to the buyer. Now, who has supplied goods to the buyer? It's the DCA who has supplied the goods, not the principal. So this is separate. DCA has supplied goods to the buyer. And in the context of that supply of goods, he has given that loan and collecting interest. Therefore, that particular transaction, That means loan transaction shall not be treated as an independent supply transaction. It is related to supply of goods. Therefore, the money which is collected by way of interest shall be added to the value of goods, and consequently GST will be levied on that. Is it clear to you now? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, friends, we'll close our current session right now. We'll catch up after some time. So thank you very much. Very soon we'll catch up. Thanks a lot.